Hi, in this video we're going to talk about sentence fragments. We're going to talk about how to identify and correct fragments. Sentence fragments are a typical sentence error, so we'll want to be able to find them and correct them so that we don't have any sentence fragments in our writing. So let's review what are the essential parts of a sentence. First, we know that we need to have a subject. The subject is a noun or a pronoun, and it names a person, place, thing, or idea that the sentence is about. We must also have a verb. The verb tells the reader something about the subject. It tells what the subject does, tells the condition of the subject, and our verb must be a complete verb. In addition, in order to have a complete sentence, it must express a complete thought. So it doesn't leave the reader hanging. It doesn't leave the reader wanting more information. So we'll look at a few examples to see exactly what that means. So fragments are fragments of a sentence. They're parts of a sentence. They're considered incomplete. So they're missing some essential part. They're either missing a verb, or missing part of a verb, or they're missing a subject, or they do not express a complete thought. So here are some examples. Phrases which do not contain both a subject and verb are fragments. So if we look at this first example, after the speech class, in the cafeteria. After speech class and in the cafeteria are both prepositional phrases. So there's no subject, no verb, it's just a phrase. It's a fragment. It's not a complete sentence. Remember that a subject and verb of a sentence will never be found inside of a prepositional phrase. Another example, at the podium for her presentation. No subject, no verb, all we have is two prepositional phrases. So it's a fragment. Here's another example, using I language with her partner. We've got a prepositional phrase and we've got part of a verb, using. In order for using to be a complete verb, we would need a form of to be with it. So we have just part of a verb and we don't have a subject. Who was using I language? Well, we don't know. Was speaking very clearly. Well, in this case, we've got a complete verb, but who was doing that? We don't know. We have no subject, so it's a fragment. In this last example, Martina from my class at LCC, well, what about Martina? What was she doing? We don't know. All we have is the subject and two prepositional phrases, but no verb. So all of these are fragments. We'll look at some additional examples. Dependent clauses, if they're all by themselves, are fragments. So they contain a subject and complete verb, but they do not express a complete thought. They leave the reader hanging, leave the reader wanting more information. So they cannot stand alone as an independent sentence. So here are examples. When the presentation was over. Well, we've got our subject, presentation, and we've got a verb, was, but it leaves us hanging. Well, what happened when the presentation was over? We want more information. Here's another example. The instructor who explained communication strategies. Well, what about the instructor? What did the instructor do? Last example, which was why they communicated well. Well, what was why they communicated well? We're missing some part of that thought, so it's leaving us hanging, wanting more information. So these are dependent clauses. They are fragments. They're not complete sentences because they do not express a complete thought. Now we're going to look at how do we correct fragments. We can join the fragment with another sentence or clause. We can add a subject if that's what's needed. We can add a verb or make the verb complete. Or we can add an independent clause. So let's look at some examples. Here we have these two prepositional phrases that comprise this fragment. At the podium for her presentation. no subject, and no verb. But we can make this a complete sentence by adding the subject, she, and adding the verb, stood. She stood at the podium for her presentation. So we can see how clearly that is now a complete sentence. It has a subject, it has the verb stood, and it expresses a complete thought. Here are another couple of examples. Martina from my class at LCC. Again, this is a fragment, does not have a verb. Here's another fragment, was speaking very clearly. Well, who was speaking very clearly? All we have is the verb. So we can combine those two to form a complete sentence. Martina from my class at LCC was speaking very clearly. Now we have a subject and a verb, and we're expressing a complete thought. We'll look at a couple more examples of correcting fragments. We looked at this example before. When the presentation was over, we've got our subject, presentation, and we've got our verb, was, but this fragment leaves us hanging. Well, what happened when the presentation was over? What we can do is combine it with an independent clause. We clapped to form a complete sentence. We can explain, well, what did happen when the presentation was over? When the presentation was over, we clapped. So now we have a complete thought. The reader is no longer left hanging or wanting more information. Here's one more example. The instructor who explained communication strategies. Well, what about that instructor? We need more information. We're left hanging here. So we can combine it with another clause to form a complete sentence. The instructor who explained communication strategies is also the debate team coach. So now we've got a complete thought. We know what we're talking about regarding that instructor. The instructor is also the debate coach, and the instructor is the same one who explained communication strategies. So together we've got a complete sentence that expresses a complete thought. So to summarize, we know that sentences require a subject, a complete verb, and they must also express a complete thought. So if we're missing something, if we have a sentence fragment, we need to correct it. We need to make it a complete sentence. And we can do that by adding a subject, by adding a verb or completing the verb, or by joining the fragment with another sentence or clause, joining it together to form a complete sentence with subject, verb, and complete thought.